Hey there folks, thanks for having a wee look at this video. So this one is how to freeze celery. Now I'm showing you this video because I've realised that I use a reasonable amount of frozen veg in my recipes. It's not all frozen, some's fresh, some's frozen. And I will reiterate, fresh veg does always taste better. It's sharper, it gives more of a snap, it is a better way to go. But we can't always go that way in the case of celery. When you buy celery, there's always too much when you buy a bunch, so it's useful to be able to freeze it, and that's what this video is for. Let's crack on, let's freeze a little bit of celery.
Now, it's worth mentioning here that the fresher the celery, the better when it comes to freezing it. The first thing we're looking to do then is slice off the root end and then discard it. And now that we can access the celery as individual stalks, we're going to clean them. I'm just pointing out there where my thumb was that there's some grit and there's some mud build up there. What we do is we just attack it with a scrubbing brush under running water to remove any mud and any grit that's on each stalk. And then all we want to do is repeat until we went through all the stalks, including the stalks that have the leafy ends in the centre. Now, the leafy end of your celery doesn't freeze very well. Now, as you've just bought the celery, I'm guessing you've already got a recipe in mind, so use up the stalks with the leafy end in the recipe and then you can freeze the other stuff. As you won't be using the leafy celery right away, because currently we're freezing the rest of the celery, just add it to a bowl and cover it and set aside. I tend to then store it in my fridge until later on that day when I do need it for the recipe that I'm using it in. As the leafy stalks tend to be your small stalks in a bunch, we should only be left with medium and large stalks. Now, the way I like to store my celery is bagged, and I tend to have it bagged as one medium to one large stalk in a bag. So somewhere between 100 and 120 grams we're going to be looking at when I come to bag it. So that when it comes to chopping our celery, we get even sizes. What we want to do is the big wide fat part of our celery, we want to split that in two. The best way forward to do that is just literally slice up to where the celery is about an even width and cut up to that point and then cut across to split that celery in two. When it comes to our medium stalks, we don't need to slice as far, so the pieces are going to be a bit smaller in length. If you discover any not so nice bits as I'm trying to show you here, just slice them off with your knife. You might need to chop a whole section off, you might be able to just slide your knife along it, but here it was a whole wee section I was just taking off as it was a bit brown and it's not the greatest again when we're coming to freeze it. So just clean up the celery as you go along. And again, after chopping them, I then noticed that there was another little bit of browning on one of my stalks, so again we just slice it off. And from here, you're going to bunch your celery into an amount you can comfortably hold, and we're going to slice it into approximately equal sizes. I like my chunks to be somewhere around the 7 to 9 millimeter mark, but you can go larger up to about 25 millimeters, 2.5 centimeters. Just try and be consistent so that all the chunks are about the same size. So when it comes to blanching and it comes to freezing, you're getting even results throughout all the celery. And once they're chopped, transfer them into a reasonable sized bowl because this will make it the easiest way to then transfer them into our water when we come to blanch them. And all we do from here is repeat the process for all our celery stalks until we're done. Prior to blanching our celery, we're going to have to prepare a basin full of cold water. Now, I live in Scotland, so our tap water's always very cold, even in the height of summer. If you're in a warmer climate, add ice if you need to make sure your water's nice and cold. Now we can bring a very large pan of water to the boil, and only once it's a rolling boil will we start with the blanching process. And once we're happy that the water's at a solid boiling point, we're going to add our celery. We're looking to bring the water back up to a rolling boil, but we're going to count the time from the second the celery entered the water. So we're going to be blanching this for 3 minutes, no shorter, no longer. The purpose of this is not to cook it, but instead to stop enzyme production and kill off any harmful microorganisms that may be on the celery which could spoil it. So we're not cooking it, we're just blanching it. So it's important we stick to the 3 minutes. As soon as our 3 minutes is up, we want to act quickly and remove it from the hob, and we're then going to pour it through a spider strainer down our sink. Spider strainers are a great catching mitt for catching all the celery as we get it out of the boiling water. Then we want to immediately take and plunge the spider strainer into our basin filled with cold water for at least the time we blanched them, which was 3 minutes, but I prefer 5 minutes. And whilst our celery is cooling, we want to go to our freezer and we're going to add a couple of silicone liners to a drawer, which we can then put the celery on once we're ready. We then want to grab 4 or 5 still joined pieces of kitchen roll and we're going to set them out on our kitchen counter because we're going to use these to absorb much of the water as we can off of the celery pieces when we bring them out the cold water. To remove the celery from the cold water, initially catch what you can with the strainer, and then what we're going to do is just pour the water through the spider strainer, catching any remaining celery. I'm very lucky, this spider strainer is exactly the same width as my sink, so it just sits on there perfectly for catching what I pour through it. And once all the celery pieces are in your spider strainer, just take and dunt it up and down a few times on the edge of your sink to remove as much of the water you can by sort of shaking it off, dunting it off. And once we're content that we've removed as much water as we can via the dunting draining method, we're then going to take and try to evenly spread, or at least as much as we can, evenly spread the celery out on the pre-prepared kitchen roll. We then want to grab a paper towel or two and just try and blot the water off the surface of the celery by moving it along, pressing down, moving it along, pressing down. In this way, we get more than enough water off so that when we come to freeze it, the water doesn't damage the celery. Now this bit's a bit difficult and there might be a better way, but what I try to do is just pull the celery along so that we're bunching a lot of it close together. The kitchen towel should be strong enough to allow us to pull it up, and as we do that it allows a little bit more blotting as we're exposing some of the other surfaces that may not have been dried correctly. And now we can transfer our celery over into a bowl so that we can take it to our freezer. Set your celery on the silicone liners and we're going to leave it on there for an hour. Just try to evenly spread out the celery with your hand so that there's not too much bunched on top of each other. If we can get it on one layer, perfect. If there's a few bits lying on top, it's not a big hassle, but try and spread it as much as possible to try and get a single layer. And once the celery has been given an hour of flash freezing, we can then remove it from the freezer. Simplest way again is just transfer it straight into a bowl so we can take it to our worktop to work on it. And we're going to add it to either freezer bags or even sandwich bags as I'm using here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I like it to be a roughly 1 medium and 1 large stalk per bag, so that means we're talking somewhere in the 100 to 120 grams worth of frozen celery that we're putting in each bag. And just to repeat the process until we're done. As long as you're sitting somewhere in that 100 120 gram mark, you should be alright. Most of the time this works out perfectly for me. Sometimes it means I end up with one with approximately 1 stalk's worth, but that tends to be rare. Most of the time I'm lucky and you get 2 bags for each one that you've got there. Now that we've got roughly even amounts of celery in all our bags, we want to try and remove the air, so just fold it down on itself and squeeze out the air. Then I tend to roll it across itself, keeping the air out of it, and seal it once we've got it fully rolled. So squeeze the air out at the bottom, roll it over itself, and then seal. And that keeps enough air out of it for freezing. And from here, it's just a simple process of sticking them back in the freezer until we need them. That's it. That's how you freeze celery.
So that's it. It's dead easy. There's nothing to it. It's supposedly difficult to freeze celery, and you supposedly get some issues with it going soft, going a bit mushy and losing a lot of flavour. I don't find that as long as I follow this method exactly. So follow the method and you'll have great celery you can freeze and crack out and use for your recipes when you need it. If you liked the video, give us a wee thumbs up. If you really liked the video, share it with one of your pals and give it a wee subscription, please. Thank you. Stay safe, folks. All the best.